Sarah paced the corridor in slippers that smoothed the carpet with soft, distracted steps. She had not, in her own reckoning, ever been particularly graceful when it came to panic. Panic came to her now the way winter came to the north, sudden and uncompromising. It intruded on the small certainties she had relied upon: the right shoe at the right moment, a friendly face on the end of a phone, the steadiness of routine. The world streaked at the edges, and every breath tasted like newsprint and cold tea. She had turned down the television before breakfast, but it had been on in another room, the headlines drifting through the old house like a draft. Royal figures asked to vacate. Uncertainty surrounds the future. Speakers in the background used phrases that scraped at her. Allegations, investigation, public reaction, words that hung from the ceiling and cast long shadows over the day. Reporters lined the gates, their cars parked like a ring of small, impatient animals. The press were not just outside, they were in the corners of her mind now, riffling through memories as if searching for the wrong key. Her daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, were the lodestar she kept in her head, not for their public titles or their reserve in interviews, but because they were hers, their small hands in hers when the thunder of the past had been overwhelming, their teenage breakfasts of toast and jam, their private jokes that had nothing to do with palaces or programs. When the room swam and her pulse climbed like something fragile trying to escape, it was their faces she clung to. Protecting them felt like the only job that still made sense. They were both busy. Beatrice had been traveling more lately, an appearance here, a charity event there. Eugenie had taken to longer hours at work, the firm of architects offering an intensity that left their phones blinking with messages she barely had the strength to answer. When she could reach them, their replies were calm, assuring in a way that rebalanced her. "Mom, we'll be fine," one would text. "We know what to do," the other would say. But across the line, where the voice cracked and patched itself, she heard worry. Worry fed on worry the way small fires on a dry hillside become a blaze. The uncertainty did not sleep. At night, Sarah lay awake in a bedroom at one end of the lodge and listened for the hoeing sounds of the night shift at the gates, the dull thrum of vehicles, the muted conversation of staff, the distant cough of a dog. Andrew slept at the other end of the house, or perhaps in another wing entirely, depending on how the papers had decided to phrase it that morning. The arrangement felt like a concession between two people who were no longer married, but still bound by a map of old loyalties. They would meet in the drawing room over decaffeinated tea, voices clipped and polite, discussing logistics as if they were planning a relocation rather than the ejection of a long, accustomed life. Sarah's hands, which had once been adept at handing out powdered mints at the right moment during ceremonial receptions, now fumbled with papers. There were letters, formally worded notes from solicitors, a vague but precise notice to vacate, and a pile of invoices that had not been there before. She read the documents with a mind that refused to hold them, as if the facts would scuttle away if she looked at them directly. Outside, a drone of voices carried on the wind. Someone finally had the time and the headline for everything. A friend arrived late that afternoon, an old school chum who had become a confidant over the years. She walked into the conservatory with a thermos and 2 cups. "Enough of that," she said, touching Sarah's shoulder. "Let me see you." Sarah allowed herself to be steered to a chair. The grip of panic receded only partially because there were things that were not just panic but reality. The orders, the practicalities, the potential humiliation. Her eyes were steady. "You look tired," she said. It was not meant as an observational barb, but it landed on Sarah like a calisthenics instructor's correction, necessary and unwelcome. She admitted before she could think. The word was a small, honest thing in the mouth of a woman who had been taught to be composed above all. She had practiced composure like a ritual, curl the fingers, align the shoulders, present the smile that read as both forgiving and amused. That veneer had been dented. "Afraid for the girls," she said. "Afraid for what people will think of them. Afraid that every little thing they've worked for will be affected." Her friend reached across the table and smoothed a stray lock of hair from Sarah's brow. She said, "They're women. They're strong. They have—" She hesitated. "They have choices and lives that are not dependent on your every move." "You don't understand," she replied. "You don't understand what this life does. It's not just about choices. It's about image and associations, an invisible ledger people keep, and sometimes even the best they do is counted in the wrong column." The friend smiled, kindly but firmly. "Then let them keep their column clear. Let them live. You can't hold them in the silvered cage of your fear. You have to teach them to fly anyway." Outside, the shutters rattled. Inside the house was a clock that had always ticked without malice. Time was the same kind of thing that did not care for anyone's panic. The movement of the hands mocked the sedentary tumult of worry. Days blurred into one another. Sarah found herself answering calls that were never meant to alleviate but to catalog. Who was to speak for the family? What should be said in statements? What could be said off the record? She learned, with a reluctant sort of competence, to craft sentences that did not say everything. "We are cooperating fully," the statement said. "We hope the process will be concluded promptly." It was all she had the strength to say. The rest she folded away and put in the same drawer as emergency stitches and a packet of lavender. Her daughters, when they were present in the way families make presence a place of solace. They drew the curtains together at dusk and cooked dinner that didn't pretend to be grand. Beatrice had a way of arranging plates that made everything look like an invitation. Eugenie came in with a new design book under her arm, and they spoke about plans for the garden. If they were forced to leave, would they find a house with a smaller bed of roses? Would the new life have enough space for their art and their work? These smaller questions were a kind of relief. They were the scaffolding of a future that might be built from pieces. On a raw morning, Sarah found herself standing at the back gate watching the reporters set up. There was an inventory of faces, some she had known for years, some new ones who carried the breathless curiosity of an audience that lived on the next scandal. One young journalist paused, camera in hand, and offered a smile that pretended to be kindly. "Madam," he said, "how are you holding up?" It was a question she knew how to answer. "Holding up," she said. It was a small, precise lie. She wanted to tell him everything, that the velvet curtains made her feel like a character in a play about someone else's life, that she kept opening doors and expecting to find the past intact. She wanted to tell him that the greatest fear was not for herself, but for the girls. Instead, she smiled the smile that had carried her before and walked away. There was a moment in the middle of such a day when panic exploded into action. She sat down at a writing desk and began to write a letter she did not plan to send to anyone but the girls. It was not a letter of resignation or of explanation. It was a letter she wrote for herself to put names to the things she feared. "If the worst happens," she wrote, "remember that you are not your associations. Remember that your childhood favors were never given out of obligation. They were given because you were kind. Remember that I loved you before the public ever knew your name." Words had weight. The simple act of writing made the panic slightly more manageable. The shape of it became visible on paper. She folded the letter and put it in an envelope addressed to both of them. For safekeeping, she told herself. The letter felt like a lifeline. Her nights became more fragmented. There were dreams in which the house was a theater, and everyone in the audience had an empty seat that should have been filled by her daughters. There were nightmares of the press tearing through the rose garden like a hungry crowd at market day. Waking, she tried to assemble sense from the dripping images. She had learned, over the past decades, how to move through sudden public storms. She had weathered tabloid tsunamis and the sharper winds of social rumor. This felt different only because the stakes were set not just against her, but against the two women she had raised. In the middle of a particularly bruised week, Beatrice stayed up with her. They spoke in the kitchen while the kettle sang. It was near midnight. Pale moonlight fell on the countertop. Beatrice said nothing for a long time, then reached across and put her hand over her mother's. "Mom," she said, "we saw the headlines. We know what they say. But the truth is, we have our lives. We are solid. We are working. What people say will ebb and flow." She wanted to hear the assurance without having to interrogate its cost. "And if people are cruel?" she asked. The voice was small and brittle. "Then we are cruel back," Beatrice said, with a dryness that made both of them laugh.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to The Royal Insider.